The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Anthony pulled his delivery van into a visitor spot at the gleaming Westfield Technologies building. The 12-story glass structure reflected the clouds above, making it look like it was touching the sky itself. Anthony checked his watch. 10:15 a.m. Right on time. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment, taking a deep breath. At 45 years old, Anthony had seen plenty in his years running his own courier service. He built Johnson Courier Services from nothing but a second-hand van and a cell phone nearly 20 years ago. Now his company had 32 employees and handled deliveries for some of the biggest businesses in the city. But today, he decided to handle this particular delivery himself. The package sitting on the passenger seat didn't look special, just a thick manila envelope sealed with blue tape, but Anthony knew it contained important board documents that needed a signature from the CEO himself, Richard Westfield. Another day, another delivery, Anthony muttered to himself as he grabbed the package and his electronic signature pad. His simple uniform, tan pants, and a navy blue polo shirt with his company's small logo was clean and pressed. Anthony always insisted on looking professional, no matter how some clients treated delivery people. The lobby of Westfield Technologies was impressive, all marble floors, modern art, and sleek furniture. Soft music played from hidden speakers as Anthony approached the front desk. A young woman with perfectly styled hair sat behind a curved white desk, typing quickly on her computer. Anthony waited patiently for her to finish whatever she was doing. 10 seconds passed, then 20. After nearly a full minute of standing there, he cleared his throat gently. "Just a moment," she said without looking up, her fingers still flying across the keyboard. Anthony nodded and waited. He'd been in enough fancy lobbies to know the drill. To some people, a delivery person was invisible, until they needed something urgently delivered. Finally, the receptionist looked up, her eyes barely meeting his before flicking back to her screen. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone making it clear that whatever he needed was an interruption to her day. "Good morning," Anthony said with a warm smile. "I have a delivery for Mr. Westfield that requires his personal signature." He placed the package on the counter and pointed to the signature required stamp in red ink. The receptionist's eyebrows rose slightly as she glanced at the package. "Just leave it here. I'll make sure he gets it," she said, already turning her attention back to her computer. Anthony kept his expression friendly. "I'm sorry, but our policy is very strict about this particular type of delivery. The sender specifically requested Mr. Westfield's signature only. I'd be happy to wait until he's available." The woman let out a small, irritated sigh. "Mr. Westfield is extremely busy. He doesn't have time to sign for packages." She pushed a notepad toward him. "I can sign for it." Anthony shook his head politely. "I understand he's busy. I wouldn't insist if it wasn't important. The instructions are very clear. Only Mr. Westfield can sign for this." The receptionist stared at him for a moment, as if trying to decide if it was worth arguing. Then she picked up her phone and pressed a button. "There's a deliveried person here who refuses to leave a package without Mr. Westfield's signature," she said to whoever answered, her eyes fixed on her screen rather than Anthony. As Anthony stood waiting, he noticed a few employees walking through the lobby glance his way. One man in a crisp suit slowed down to listen to the conversation, a slight smirk forming on his face. Anthony had been in this position countless times before. He knew what was coming. But even after 20 years in the business, it still bothered him how quickly some people judged others based on their job. He straightened his shoulders and kept his expression neutral, preparing himself for what would happen next. The receptionist hung up the phone. "Someone will be right out," she said flatly, returning to her typing without another word. Anthony didn't have to wait long. The elevator doors slid open with a soft ping, and a man in his mid-30s stepped out. He wore an expensive gray suit with a blue tie that matched the company logo, and his hair was styled with just enough gel to look effortless. The man's confident stride as he crossed the lobby told Anthony everything he needed to know. This wasn't the CEO, but someone who thought of himself as important. "I'm Trevor Phillips, assistant manager," the man announced, not bothering to offer his hand. "Lisa tells me there's an issue with a delivery?" His tone suggested that any issue must clearly be Anthony's fault. Anthony gave a polite nod. "Good morning, Mr. Phillips. There's no issue really. I just need Mr. Westfield's signature on this package." He tapped the delivery form. Sender's instructions are very specific. Trevor looked at Anthony as if he were a child who couldn't understand simple instructions. "Look, buddy," he said, emphasizing the word in a way that made it sound anything but friendly, "Mr. Westfield is in back-to-back meetings all morning. He's an extremely busy man running a multi-million-dollar company." He gestured to the receptionist without looking at her. "Lisa can sign for it, or I can. That's the best we can do." Anthony had dealt with people like Trevor for 20 years. He kept his voice level. "I understand Mr. Westfield is busy. I'm happy to wait, or I can come back at a better time. But I can't leave this package without his signature." Trevor's eyebrows rose slightly. "You can't be serious." "Company policy," Anthony explained simply. "I don't make the rules, I just follow them." Trevor let out an exaggerated sigh, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. A few employees who had been walking through the lobby slowed down, sensing the developing drama. "Do you have any idea what happens in this building?" Trevor asked, his voice getting louder. "We're developing technology that's going to change the world. Mr. Westfield doesn't have time for this." Anthony noticed more employees gathering around, some pretending to check their phones while clearly listening in. A woman with short blonde hair whispered something to her colleague, and they both smirked. "I respect your time," Anthony said calmly. "And I respect Mr. Westfield's time too. That's why I'd be happy to wait or schedule another delivery time that works better." Trevor crossed his arms. "Just leave the package." "I'm sorry, but I can't do that." The standoff was drawing even more attention now. A small group had formed near the reception desk, and Anthony could feel their eyes on him. He'd been a delivery man long enough to know what they saw, just another stubborn service worker causing problems. "Is there an issue here?" A woman's voice cut through the tension. She approached from a nearby hallway, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her tailored pantsuit and the way others stepped aside told Anthony she was higher up the chain than Trevor. "Ms. Wilson," Trevor said, straightening his posture slightly. "This delivery person is refusing to leave a package without Mr. Westfield's signature." The woman, Ms. Wilson, surveyed the situation with cool eyes. "And what's so special about this package that it needs the CEO's signature?" She didn't address Anthony directly, speaking about him as if he weren't standing right there. "Nothing special about the package," Anthony explained, maintaining eye contact despite her dismissive tone. "Just following the sender's instructions." Ms. Wilson exchanged a look with Trevor, the kind of look people share when they think someone is being difficult on purpose. "Where exactly did you say you're from?" she asked, finally addressing Anthony directly. Her eyes moved to the small logo on his shirt, taking in his simple uniform. "Johnson Courier Services," Anthony replied. "We handle confidential deliveries for many businesses downtown." Someone in the growing crowd of onlookers chuckled. "Never heard of it," a male voice muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Another voice added, "Probably runs it out of his garage," triggering more quiet laughter. Anthony felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd built his business from nothing, working 7 days a week for years. These people knew nothing about him, yet they'd already decided who he was. Ms. Wilson tilted her head slightly. "Well, Mr. Johnson Courier, we have a strict protocol here too. No one sees Mr. Westfield without an appointment." Anthony was about to respond when the elevator doors opened again. This time, a tall woman with sharp features and perfectly styled dark hair stepped out. Everything about her, from her designer outfit to her confident walk, screamed authority. The small crowd of employees straightened up immediately. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice cutting through the tension. Her eyes moved from Trevor to Ms. Wilson, then landed on Anthony. "Mrs. Hudson," Trevor said quickly. "Just a delivery issue we're handling." Mrs. Hudson, who Anthony guessed was likely the department manager based on everyone's reactions, approached the group with an air of someone used to solving problems quickly. "I'm Patricia Hudson, head of operations," she said, not offering her hand. "What seems to be the problem?" Before Anthony could answer, Trevor jumped in. This delivery man insists on getting Mr. Westfield's personal signature and refuses to leave the package with us." Mrs. Hudson looked at Anthony as if he were a puzzle she couldn't quite figure out. "Is that right?" "Yes, ma'am," Anthony replied calmly. "The sender specified that only Mr. Westfield can sign for this package. I'm just following the instructions I was given." Mrs. Hudson exchanged glances with Ms. Wilson, then let out a laugh that wasn't really a laugh at all, more like a sound of disbelief. "Well, that's not going to happen today. Mr. Westfield is preparing for a board meeting." "I understand," Anthony said. "I'd be happy to come back at a more convenient time." Or, Mrs. Hudson said slowly, as if talking to someone who might not understand basic concepts, "You could just leave it with us like any normal delivery service would do." The crowd had grown larger now. There must have been 15 employees watching the scene unfold, some not even pretending to be doing anything else. A young man in the back whispered something to his colleague, and they both snickered. "I wish I could," Anthony said, maintaining his professional tone. "But my company has strict policies about signature-required deliveries." Mrs. Hudson crossed her arms. "And what company is that again?" "Johnson Courier Services," Anthony replied. A voice from the crowd called out, "Never seen that name on any of the big delivery trucks." This triggered a wave of poorly hidden laughter. "Probably a one-man operation," another voice added. Mrs. Hudson didn't silence them. Instead, she smiled slightly, clearly enjoying Anthony's discomfort. "Tell me," she said, leaning against the reception desk, "does your company have many clients like Westfield Technologies?" The way she said company made it clear what she thought of his business. Anthony felt a familiar burn in his chest, the same feeling he'd had countless times when people underestimated him because of his job or the color of his skin. "We have quite a few corporate clients," he answered simply, refusing to take the bait. "I bet you do." Trevor chimed in, his voice tripping with sarcasm. He turned to the group. "Probably delivers to all the Fortune 500 companies, right?" More laughter followed. One employee stepped forward slightly, mimicking Anthony's stance and serious expression. "Company policy," he said in a mocking deep voice. "Very important package." Anthony's face remained neutral, but his grip on the package tightened slightly. 20 years of building a successful business, and still, people saw only what they wanted to see. Mrs. Hudson checked her watch dramatically. "Well, as fascinating as this is, we all have actual work to do." She turned to Trevor. "Call security and have them escort our friend here out. We don't have time for this nonsense." "Already done," Trevor said with a smug smile. "They should be here any minute." As if on cue, 2 security guards stepped off the elevator and began walking toward the group. The crowd of employees parted to let them through, many now openly smirking at Anthony's impending removal. Throughout it all, Anthony stood tall, his expression calm despite the humiliation. These people thought they knew everything about him based on his uniform and job. They had no idea who he really was or what he had accomplished. The mockery stung, but Anthony had faced worse in building his business from nothing. Just as the security guards reached him, someone called out from across the lobby, "What's happening over there?" The powerful, commanding voice caused everyone to turn toward the main entrance. A man in an expensive suit was walking briskly toward them, his expression concerned and curious. The crowd of employees suddenly fell silent. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted instantly. The man who had just entered the lobby radiated authority. He was in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. Everyone's attention immediately shifted to him, and Anthony noticed how the employees' expressions changed, from amusement to something closer to worry. "Mr. Westfield," Mrs. Hudson said, her voice suddenly much warmer. "We were just handling a small situation." So this was Richard Westfield himself, the CEO Anthony had been trying to reach. The timing couldn't have been better. "I can see that," Mr. Westfield replied, his eyes scanning the unusual gathering in his lobby. "What's going on here? Why are there so many people away from their desks?" Trevor stepped forward. "Sir, this delivery person is being difficult about a package. We've called security to handle it." The security guards stood on either side of Anthony now, waiting for final instructions before removing him. One of them reached for Anthony's arm. "I just need a moment with Mr. Westfield," Anthony said calmly to the guard. "The package is for him personally." Mr. Westfield walked closer, his brow furrowed. "A package for me that requires my signature." "Yes, sir," Anthony replied. Sender's instructions were very specific. Mr. Westfield studied Anthony's face for a moment, and then something changed in his expression. His eyes widened slightly, and he tilted his head as if trying to place a familiar face. "Wait a minute," Mr. Westfield said, stepping closer. "Do I know you?" The lobby fell completely silent. Every employee watched the exchange, confused by their CEO's reaction. Anthony gave a small smile. "We've met a few times, yes?" Mr. Westfield stared for another moment, and then his serious expression broke into a wide grin. "Anthony? Anthony Johnson." Anthony nodded. "Hello, Richard." The CEO let out a laugh of surprise and stepped forward, extending his hand. Anthony shook it firmly. "It's been, 5 years? That business conference in Chicago?" Mr. Westfield said, his tone completely changed from the authoritative CEO to something much warmer. 6 years, actually. The National Business Leadership Summit, Anthony corrected with a smile. The employees watched in stunned silence. The security guards exchanged confused glances, unsure if they should still be flanking Anthony. Mrs. Hudson's mouth had fallen slightly open. Trevor looked like he just swallowed something sour. Ms. Wilson was blinking rapidly, trying to process what was happening. "What are you doing delivering packages?" Mr. Westfield asked, genuinely curious. Anthony's smile widened slightly. "I own the company, Richard. Johnson Courier Services. Sometimes I like to handle important deliveries personally, especially when they're for old friends." A wave of whispers spread through the crowd of employees. The young man who had mimicked Anthony earlier was now staring at the floor, his face flushed with embarrassment. Mr. Westfield laughed again. "Of course you do. Still hands-on with your business, just like you talked about at the summit." He turned to his employees, who were all frozen in place. "Everyone, this is Anthony Johnson. He runs one of the most successful courier companies in the state." A few weak smiles appeared among the staff, but most looked like they wished the floor would open up and swallow them whole. "I had no idea you handled our deliveries," Mr. Westfield continued, turning back to Anthony. "We just signed the contract last month," Anthony explained. "Your operations department approved it after reviewing several bids." He glanced briefly at Mrs. Hudson, whose face had turned an interesting shade of pale. "Well, I'm glad to have your company on board," Mr. Westfield said. He pointed to the package in Anthony's hand. "Is that what needs my signature?" "Yes," Anthony replied, handing over his electronic signature pad. "It's the final paperwork for the new board appointment." Mr. Westfield raised an eyebrow. "The board appointment? So you know about that already?" Anthony nodded. "I received the delivery instructions this morning." As Mr. Westfield signed the electronic pad, he looked up at Anthony with a mysterious smile. "Then you know exactly what's in this package." Anthony's expression gave nothing away. "I only know it's important, sir." Mr. Westfield finished signing and took the package. He turned to address the still shocked gathering of employees. "I think that's enough excitement for now. Doesn't everyone have work to do?" The crowd quickly dispersed, with people hurrying back to their desks and offices. The security guards backed away, looking embarrassed. Only Mrs. Hudson, Trevor, and Ms. Wilson remained, all three looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Anthony," Mr. Westfield said, "would you mind joining me in my office for a few minutes? I think we have something important to discuss." Anthony nodded. "It would be my pleasure, Richard." The elevator ride to the top floor was filled with a comfortable silence between old acquaintances. When the doors opened, Anthony followed Richard down a hallway lined with awards and framed magazine covers featuring Westfield Technologies' achievements. Richard's assistant looked up in surprise as they approached. "Hold my calls for the next 30 minutes, Diane," Richard said as he ushered Anthony into his spacious corner office. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city skyline. Richard gestured for Anthony to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Coffee," Richard offered. "Black, if you have it," Anthony replied. Richard pressed a button on his desk phone. "Diane, 2 coffees, please, both black." He sat down and placed the package on his desk, but didn't open it immediately. Sir Richard said, leaning back in his chair, should I apologize for my staff, or do you want to tell me exactly what happened down there? Anthony shrugged slightly. Nothing worth getting upset about. I've dealt with worse. I know that look, Richard said, studying his old acquaintance's face. They gave you a hard time. Anthony nodded. Let's just say they made certain assumptions about me based on what they saw, a delivery man in a simple uniform. The door opened and Diane brought in 2 cups of coffee, setting them down before quietly leaving. Richard took a sip before continuing. Tell me everything, he insisted. Anthony recounted the events in the lobby, the dismissive receptionist, Trevor's condescension, Mrs. Hudson's mockery, and the employees who had joined in. Richard's expression darkened as he listened. That's not what this company stands for, he said firmly. Not what I stand for. People make judgments all the time, Anthony replied. It's human nature. It's poor leadership, Richard countered. And it stops today. He took another sip of his coffee, then gestured to the package. You said you know what's in here. Anthony smiled slightly. The courier service gets delivery instructions, and yours were quite specific. Richard opened the package and pulled out several official-looking documents. These are the final papers confirming your appointment to our board of directors, he said. I was going to call you this afternoon to tell you the vote was unanimous. I appreciate the confidence the board has in me, Anthony replied. Richard leaned forward. Your technology background combined with your experience building a business from the ground up is exactly what we need, Anthony. But after what I just witnessed, I realize we need your perspective even more than I thought. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. We've grown so fast these past few years. Sometimes I worry we've lost touch with our roots, with the values we started with. He turned back to Anthony. The company culture clearly needs work. A knock at the door interrupted them. Richard called for the person to enter, and Mrs. Hudson appeared, looking uncomfortable. Mr. Westfield, I wanted to. She stopped short when she saw Anthony sitting comfortably with the CEO. Patricia, Richard said, his voice cool, perfect timing. I'd like to formally introduce you to Anthony Johnson. As of this morning, he's the newest member of our board of directors. The color drained from Mrs. Hudson's face. Her mouth opened and closed without making a sound. Mr. Johnson owns Johnson Courier Services, Richard continued. They handle confidential deliveries for over half the Fortune 500 companies in this city, including all our competitors. And now us. Mrs. Hudson stared at Anthony, finally seeing him, really seeing him, for the first time. I didn't realize. Clearly, Richard said. He picked up the phone. Diane, please ask Trevor Phillips and... He looked at Anthony. Ms. Wilson, Anthony supplied. And Ms. Wilson to join us immediately, Richard finished. Mrs. Hudson looked like she might be sick. Sir, I can explain. I'm sure you can, Richard interrupted. And you'll have that opportunity. But first, I think apologies are in order. Another knock, and Trevor and Ms. Wilson entered. They froze when they spotted Anthony sitting beside their CEO. Perfect, Richard said. Now we're all here. He stood and placed a hand on Anthony's shoulder. I'd like you all to meet Anthony Johnson, Harvard Business School graduate, former technology consultant, founder and CEO of Johnson Courier Services, and as of this morning, the newest member of our board of directors. The 3 employees stared in horror as the full implications of their behavior dawned on them. Richard's voice was calm but firm as he continued, Anthony will be overseeing our company culture initiative, effective immediately. I think his first-hand experience today gives him unique insight into where we need to improve, don't you? The silence in Richard's office was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mrs. Hudson, Trevor, and Ms. Wilson stood frozen, their faces a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and growing fear. Anthony sat calmly, his hands folded in his lap, watching as the 3 employees who had mocked him just minutes earlier tried to process the sudden change in their world. Trevor was the first to find his voice. Mr. Johnson, he stammered, I want to apologize for my behavior downstairs. I had no idea. That's exactly the problem, Richard cut in, his voice firm but not angry. You shouldn't need to know someone's title to treat them with basic respect. Ms. Wilson stepped forward slightly. Sir, we were just following protocol about packages. Were you following protocol when you allowed your staff to mock Mr. Johnson? Richard asked. Was that in our company handbook? Mrs. Hudson looked at the floor, her usual confidence completely gone. There's no excuse for how we behaved, she admitted quietly. I'm truly sorry, Mr. Johnson. Anthony studied them for a moment. He built his business facing prejudice and assumptions every step of the way. Part of him wanted to let them squirm a bit longer, but that wasn't who he was. I appreciate your apology, he finally said. But I'm not the only delivery person who's walked through your doors. I'm just the one who happened to know your boss. The weight of his words settled on everyone in the room. Anthony wasn't just talking about himself. He was talking about a pattern of behavior that affected countless people every day. Richard nodded thoughtfully. Anthony's right. This isn't about one incident. It's about who we are as a company. He turned to the 3 employees. I founded Westfield Technologies with a simple idea, that innovation comes from respecting every perspective. Somewhere along the way, we've lost sight of that. Mrs. Hudson cleared her throat. What can we do to make this right? Richard looked at Anthony. That's a question for our newest board member. Anthony will be heading up our company culture initiative. I expect you all to give him your full cooperation. The 3 employees nodded quickly, eager to show their willingness to change. For starters, Anthony said, rising from his chair, I'd like to meet with your frontline staff, receptionists, security guards, maintenance workers, the people who see everything but are rarely seen. Trevor blinked in surprise. The maintenance staff. They're the ones who know what's really happening in a company, Anthony explained. They hear how people talk when they think nobody important is listening. Ms. Wilson's face flushed with the realization that her own behavior had likely been observed by staff she'd never bothered to notice. I'd also like to implement a shadow program, Anthony continued. Every executive, including the 3 of you, will spend 1 day each quarter working in service positions, reception, mailroom, cafeteria, delivery. Mrs. Hudson's eyes widened. You want us to work in the mailroom? I want you to understand every job in this company, Anthony corrected her. Hard to respect what you don't understand. Richard smiled. I think that's an excellent idea. I'll be the first to volunteer. A knock on the door interrupted them. Diane poked her head in. I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Westfield, but your next appointment is here. Richard nodded. Thank you, Diane. We're just wrapping up. He turned to the 3 employees. I'll expect detailed reports on your desks by tomorrow morning about how we're going to address the culture issues Mr. Johnson experienced today. They nodded silently, understanding they were dismissed. As they filed out, each one stopped to offer Anthony another apology. He accepted them with a simple nod. When the door closed behind them, Richard turned to Anthony. Too harsh. Anthony shook his head. Not harsh enough, if you ask me, but it's a start. Well, the board meeting next week should be interesting, Richard said with a small smile. Your first official act as a board member will be presenting your findings on our company culture. Anthony leaned back in his chair. You know, when I started Johnson Courier Services, people laughed at me. A small operation trying to compete with the big companies. He gestured toward the window and the city beyond. 20 years later, we handle deliveries for half the businesses in those skyscrapers. Richard nodded. And now you'll help us build a better company culture. It's not complicated, Richard, Anthony said simply. Treat everyone like they might be a CEO, because someday they might be. 3 months later, Anthony pulled his car into the visitor parking space at Westfield Technologies. He smiled to himself, remembering his last visit. So much had changed since that day, both for him and for the company. As he walked toward the building entrance, he noticed something different. The security guard standing at the door, an older man with kind eyes, was greeting everyone who entered with a warm smile and genuine hello. When Anthony approached, the guard's face lit up with recognition. Good morning, Mr. Johnson. Good to see you again, sir. Morning, George, Anthony replied, pleased that he remembered the guard's name from his last visit. How's that grandson of yours doing in college? George beamed. Just made the dean's list. First one in our family to go to college, and he's crushing it. That's wonderful, Anthony said sincerely. Send him my congratulations. Inside the lobby, the difference was like night and day. The receptionist, a young woman with a bright smile, looked up immediately as he entered. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," she greeted him warmly. "Mr. Westfield is expecting you. Can I get you coffee while you wait?" "That would be great, thank you," Anthony replied. "Black, please." "Of course," she nodded, "and congratulations on the new contract. Everyone's talking about it." Anthony's courier company had recently won a major contract that would double their business, partly thanks to the reputation boost from his work with Westfield Technologies. As he waited, Anthony observed the lobby. Employees walking through greeted each other with genuine smiles. A delivery woman from another company was being treated with courtesy at the front desk. The whole atmosphere felt lighter, more human. "Quite a change, isn't it?" came Richard's voice from behind him. Anthony turned and shook his friend's hand. "I'm impressed. Real change doesn't usually happen this quickly." "It does when the CEO spends a day working in the mailroom," Richard laughed. "Nothing like sorting packages for 8 hours to give you a new perspective. I had no idea how much work goes into keeping this place running." They walked together toward the elevators, nodding to employees along the way. "The shadow program has been the most effective thing we've done," Richard continued. "Last week, Mrs. Hudson spent a day with the cleaning staff. She came to me afterward and requested a raise for the entire department. Said she'd never worked so hard in her life." Anthony nodded. People respect what they understand. In the elevator, Richard pressed the button for the conference room floor. "The quarterly report is ready. Employee satisfaction is up 37% and turnover is down nearly 40% since you came on board. The board members are very impressed." "And Trevor?" Anthony asked. "How's he doing with the changes?" Richard's expression softened. "That's actually the biggest surprise. After his day working in reception, he came to me with a whole plan to improve frontline staff training. Said he never realized how many decisions they have to make every day, how many difficult people they deal with. He's been leading our Respect initiative ever since." The elevator doors opened to reveal a newly designed space. A large sign on the wall read, "Respect every person, value every role." Beneath it were photos of employees from all departments, from executives to maintenance staff, each with their name and a short quote about their contribution to the company. "This was Trevor's idea," Richard explained. "He wanted everyone to be seen." They entered the conference room where several board members were already gathered, along with Mrs. Hudson, Trevor, and other department heads. The atmosphere was relaxed and collaborative, nothing like the tense hierarchy Anthony had witnessed on his first visit. When Trevor saw Anthony, he approached immediately, hand extended. "Mr. Johnson, good to see you. I've been reviewing the courier efficiency report you suggested. It's already saving us thousands in shipping costs." "Glad to hear it," Anthony replied, shaking his hand. The transformation in the young manager was remarkable, from arrogant to humble, from dismissive to eager to learn. As the meeting began, Anthony sat back and watched Richard lead the discussion. Each person in the room, regardless of title or position, was given time to speak and was listened to with genuine interest. When it was Anthony's turn to present the quarterly culture report, he kept it simple. "The numbers speak for themselves," he said, "but the real story is in the people. When you create a culture of respect, everyone thrives." After the meeting, Richard walked Anthony back to the lobby. "You know," Richard said thoughtfully, "that day when you came in as a delivery man was one of the best things that ever happened to this company. It opened our eyes." Anthony nodded. "Sometimes we need to see ourselves through someone else's eyes to really understand who we are." As he headed toward the exit, Anthony passed the front desk where a delivery woman was dropping off packages. The receptionist was thanking her with genuine appreciation, and nearby employees smiled as they passed. Outside in the bright afternoon sun, Anthony paused to look back at the building. He thought about his journey, from a struggling entrepreneur facing daily prejudice to a respected business owner and board member. The lesson he taught Westfield Technologies was one he'd learned long ago. True success comes not from how you treat the powerful, but from how you treat those you believe have no power at all. With a satisfied smile, Anthony headed to his car. There was more work to be done, more minds to change, but today in this building at least, something important had shifted. And that was enough for now.